Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast.
Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I am your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm a journalist and editor and the author of over 30 published novels. And on this week's episode, I have a return guest, AJ Odasso. And they're going to be talking about the newest book, your first novel. And go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we will jump in, because this is a fun one to talk about.
Hi, my name is AJ Odasso. I teach here at San Juan College. I'm one of the newer full-time members of the English faculty. My previous visit on this show was to talk about The Sting of It, which was my poetry collection that came out in 2019 and won the New Mexico Arizona Book Award for the LGBT category that year. So I teach, I write, working on a new novel at the moment that is called Closer Than We Appear. And the summer is coming to a close, and I'm starting to get a little stir-crazy, so I actually can't wait to get back to teaching.
Give our listeners just a brief overview, without giving away too much, of the concept of this book.
This book has a long and complicated history that's kind of neat. In the summer of 2013, when Baz Luhrmann's adaptation of The Great Gatsby came out, I was between jobs, I was in a rut, but I was really looking forward to this film because The Great Gatsby has always been one of my favorite novels. And so I went to see it alone because I couldn't convince any of my housemates or my then partner to go see it with me. And I think in the span of a week, I saw it about 2 or 3 times because I was just so taken with how appropriately over the top it was and how faithful to the book it was and how excellent I thought the casting was. And one of the other things that I do in my spare time is that I write fan fiction. And I occasionally dip my fingers into writing classic lit fandom or rare fandoms. But it got The Great Gatsby back in my head. I reread the novel after seeing the film a few times, and it reminded me of how sad I was when I got to the end, my junior year of high school. I remember the day my English teacher let us finish reading in class. I actually started crying at desk because I was so tired of characters that you could arguably read some, at the very minimum, homosocial, but maybe even homoromantic or homosexual subtext between Nick and Jay. And I had felt this way when I read Hamlet for the first time in junior high. So I just had these kind of repeated, you try to see yourself in text. You get sad about those characters always dying when there's a strong bond. And I thought to myself, well, this part-time job I'm working is so crappy. And so I would come home at night after my shift and I started writing a novella. I was pretty sure it was going to turn out about novella length, and I said, well, what if I just tilt one of the events at the end of the novel so that Gatsby survives the gunshot? He's kind of left, high and dry. All of his ill-gotten gains are going to be taken back by the crime bosses he was working with. But he does have Nick still by his side, because if you remember in the novel, Nick's the only one who stays, one of the only people who's there for his funeral. So I theorized, well, if Jay somehow survives that gunshot by the skin of his teeth, and I ended up sort of expanding the story over about the span of a little more than a decade in story, so from the 1920s into the late 1930s, because the beginnings of World War II sort of are a minor plot point at one stage. It is a love story, so my premise is that in the process of recovery and realizing they only really have each other, Nick and Jay fall in love. Now, when The Great Gatsby went into public domain, I think it was 2 years ago now, I had heard that there were 2 other novels that were already lined up to be published in 2021. This novella, The Pursued and the Pursuing, I had posted it to, there's an archive online called An Archive of Our Own, known as AO3. It's probably the biggest open source place where people post fan fiction, works based on classic lit, original fiction, even if they don't want to self-publish for money. They're being DDoS attacked today. They've been down for around 48 hours because a hate group has said you're one of the biggest sources of LGBT fiction online, so this is why we're attacking your site. So it's been down.
Oh, wow.
It's been hard for people to access things, but a friend of mine said, hey, you've got this thing that you wrote in 2013, and it's excellent. You should really get a jump on expanding it into novel length and seeing if you can find a publisher. Now, at this point, it was late 2020, so I was already way behind the other two novels that I'd heard about that were already in the wings with very major publishers. So I buckled down in about November, December of 2020. I spent a couple of months starting to revamp the text and expand it. And that wasn't too difficult to do because it doesn't just stay a love story. It becomes about Daisy gets back in touch with Nick. She doesn't realize where Nick's been or what he's been doing or who he's been with. She's been so out of it and out of the country that she doesn't even know Jay has survived. And there's the matter of her daughter Pam, who appears for all of one page in the original novel. Pam, like as a toddler, who says, like, how do you do? And is whisked away by a nurse. Daisy gets in touch, says, my daughter, father's kind of against it, but she wants to go to college. And we have women's colleges in New England because Nick and Jay are based in Boston at this point. So she's like, Nick, I heard from a great aunt that you're in Boston now. She thinks, can I bring my daughter? Can we stay with you? Can we see you? And so right away, here are two guys who really don't necessarily want to let one of the people who ruined their lives back into their life, but they remember the kid. And they feel sort of bad for a kid who has parents like Daisy and Tom. So that takes up the main body of the plot. The two of them reconnecting with people they would rather forget about, but also finding that they connect with this teenager very well, and she becomes a pretty big part of their lives. And it was a real joy to give Pam a life, give her more than just, a cameo as a prop, like a child Daisy forgets about. Anyhow, it took me, I think, until about the middle of January 2021 to get it to be considered a novel. I spent January and February pitching it to agents, and most of them said this is excellent writing, but it's too short of a novel for us to want to get on. And I gave up on agents, and I said, you know what, I really need to just start targeting independent publishers on my own, which is pretty much what I've done with my poetry my whole life. I've never self-published, but I've always targeted like small imprints that I think are a good fit. And I finally, I think it was mid-March, actually when I think about the timeline of how I buckled down, expanded it, tried agents, that route wasn't working, tried smaller imprints, it was really not that much time. I got Dart Frog Blue, which is the traditional publishing imprint of Dart Frog Books, which does hybrid and also offers like some self-publishing platform. They liked the manuscript, and I said, there's these other two books that are coming out. If somehow we can get a release date that's like maybe even a little later this summer after the other ones will come out, it'll stagger it nicely and they could ride the wave of it a bit.
Yeah.
And it has worked out fairly nicely. I mean, they were able to get it to press, I think, in July 2021, July or August. And that is the story of how this book...
Well, thank you. It's a good overview of the process, because I think that's something that a lot of people don't always know a lot about. Like, they want to write a book, they're interested in writing, then what?
It's frustrating and it's time-consuming because there are so many different avenues available to writers. If you want the absolute fastest way to get your work out there and you don't care about money, look at an archive like AO3. You can start posting your stories and there are millions of readers that traffic that site. If you want to self-publish, Amazon platforms that now. There are companies like one of Dart Frog's imprints that for fee and fairly expensive at that can help you self-publish. Obviously, the optimal route is to be pretty fortunate and get an agent and have them be able to submit your work on your behalf to Big Five publishers. I wasn't that lucky the first time around, but I have this book to thank for the literary agent that I signed with just a couple months ago. And I'm working on, I mentioned the new novel. It's modern day. It's maybe tangentially related in that there's kind of a love triangle in it. It's a very queer story, much like this one is. It doesn't have too much more in common other than it kind of takes a three protagonists model and has social and romantic complications. I hesitate to call it a romance novel because it's not a romance novel. It's more upmarket fiction, I think.
With some romance elements.
Yes. If you have a piece of work that you really want to get out there and self-publish it, you should do it because you never know when you'll be able to point to that work and say, hey, look, I've written a couple of books already. And the agent can take a look and say, oh, hey, I like your style. Because I was able to sign with that agent without having the new novel fully finished. And that's kind of unusual.
Yeah.
I think to encourage any writers of any age who might be listening, it's definitely been an uphill climb if you start out in poetry, maybe doubly so because agents don't take on poets unless you're Seamus Haney big or Carol Ann Duffy big or, whoever. Very much just going it on my own and pushing my own stuff around. But that pays off in the long run. My advice is to get work out there, right? Get your work out if you want people to start seeing it, if you want to have a portfolio.
Building your resume. Your writing resume, there's something to point to. And I think that goes along with today's publishing world, having your author platform, developing your presence online as a writer of whatever genre you're in. That matters so much now for a lot of, especially if you want to go a traditional route with the agent and the big five publishers or one of their imprints or I think that's a great point of just starting to build that reputation. And I think that goes along with making sure that what you're putting out there is the quality that you want an agent or a publisher looking at. And that may be a little bit different for things like maybe Wattpad, or I haven't participated in a lot of those in a long time, so I don't know what the other popular ones are right now. It can be more of a write as you go type thing. So maybe not as polished, but starting to get that group of interested people who can build a support base for you.
So many high-profile YA novelists in particular, YA and genre fiction, started out writing fan fiction, posting their work on AO3fanfiction.net, Wattpad. So it's an increasingly legitimate, in fact, I would say it is now. It used to be, like when I was 14, 15 and starting to write, I was a Broadway musical nut as a kid, so I was like writing stuff based on musical plot lines. And I remember how stigmatized it was even up through maybe the end of my undergrad or like the first master's degree that I did. You had to be so careful not to tell people that you wrote transformative works, or you could be just, shunned from the publishing world. If you were in academia, it could be seen as a black mark on your record. But nowadays, most writers, most young writers have gotten their start that way. I didn't think I'd see that in my lifetime. This major pastime that has given me such a community over the years and has helped me to become a better writer, I didn't think I would see it destigmatized, or I didn't think that something I wrote in that community would become a book that I'm sitting here talking about right now. So.
Yeah, the view has definitely shifted a lot. And I think communities like Wattpad and even the defunct now Kindle Worlds venture, things like that, where it was like, this is an interesting thing to try. Let's see how it works. And I don't know all the reasons behind why Kindle Worlds folded eventually, but it was interesting that some of the bigger writers who opened up their worlds found ways to keep those shorter works and novels alive under their own imprints. And I think it opened up the mindset even more of just, we can play in the same sandbox. Yes, they still own the rights and they control how their work is used and in what manner. But I thought that was a really neat venture to try and gave some new authors some opportunities to not only write something that they really enjoyed with characters they had fun with, but in some of the cases, it really kind of built up a sense of mentorship with some of them from some of the writers who were willing to do that. Like Jana DeLeon, she started her own imprint to keep a lot of those Kindle Worlds books alive, and some of the others as well.
Rick Riord works with younger up-and-coming writers who write novels set in his universe.
And that is a good point. Fantasy and sci-fi kind of opened up to that a lot sooner than others.
Because it's in those communities that fan fiction became a thing in the first place.
With this, it's interesting. I've used some sort of piece of classic literature or an excerpt as a writing exercise in a class. I've found that to be effective and helpful for younger writers to look at something that is generally considered a good piece of writing and has something interesting about it that's lasted through time, and have them work with that and either rewrite it in a modern sense or take a different viewpoint on a character or a different ending or what have you. So it's really neat to see something that personally I've found to be an effective way to help young writers start on their writing journey. And you were able to take something that you loved and you were passionate about and then further develop it. And I wanted to ask you about the progression of Nick and Jay's character over the course of the book. They start out Nick and Jay and they end up very different. And it was interesting to see that progression over the course of the book and the different things that affected them, especially with Pam coming into their lives. And I was just curious how that worked for you as far as the process of taking very iconic characters and making them into your own.
So at the end of the novel, they're 30, basically, so fairly young men still. And the way I thought about their character arcs, even when the work was still a novella, it still covered about that decade, but I was going back in and sort of expanding sections and scenes. Because it ends up maybe, I added some scenes throughout the novella and then I extended the ending a little bit. But the way I was thinking about it, even when I started the novella, is Jay is so worried about his image, what people think of him, what people are drawn to him. And Nick, for the most part, is an observer who kind of is content to be dragged along to things because we know he was Tom's friend in college. Those little references back to just he was always the tag along with Tom. Now he's the tag along with Jay, and he doesn't really get super fired up and emotionally involved until near the end of the novel. So I thought about this, like, what if Jay, having survived this event and knowing that Daisy's gone from his life for good, he finds peace with that. He's fine with that. That's the place he ends up, and he's like, well, I lost everything. I lost the person that I thought I was meant to be with, but now, you know what? I'm free. Like, I don't have any of that stuff left weighing me down. So Jay, over time, cares less about what people think about him and becomes more secure in his identity, whereas I think Nick, over time, starts to take more of a forefront in his own life, and when you do that, you interact with more people, you start to care about more people, you have more stake, you have more to lose. So Jay goes from being someone who has so much to lose to somebody who's very secure and knows who he is. And Nick sort of becomes someone who now has... It's not to say that Jay has nothing to lose, because he has Nick, he has Pam, but Nick becomes a person who's just much more self-conscious and defensive and really, really willing to, lash out if he or his people are threatened. So they kind of swap places in a way from where they started out. I also like to think that by the end of the Pursuing that Nick is able to settle back into more security in himself and in his family. That was what helped me conceptualize how they would change as people over time. Nick develops some, where Jay had a lot of vices at one point. He kind of almost goes sober, like, the very literal excesses of alcohol and smoking and all that. Jay really just kind of doesn't do much of that anymore, but Nick develops a drinking problem. I think the best way of putting it is Nick, he's happier than he was before, but he also finds out that becoming happy and outspoken and attached to people also gets you a lot of conflict. Mm-hmm. You can fall into coping mechanisms and things like that.
Absolutely. It felt like, for both of them, this dual journey of healing and also growing up in a way that neither of them really had to that point.
And they were not encouraged to do so, because when you become nouveau riche like Jay does and you have more money than God, well, you're just going to flaunt it left, right, and center. Nobody's going to say no to you. And Nick grew up fairly comfortable. If not top tier wealthy, he was definitely upper middle class to lower to like middling, because he's a relative of Daisy's. So their entire family that's spread between the South and the Midwest, they both are not accustomed to being grown-ups, I guess. And they have to learn how to do that.
Yeah. It's not an easy process.
I think that they do much better for having each other in their lives, but also suddenly having a young person who has just a terrible home situation with her parents and is going to be going to school in the basically same greater metropolitan area that you have decided to make your home. That kid is just going to rely, and that's what happens. Pam relies more and more on them for support. Even Daisy and Tom change a little. I think Daisy grows up as well. Because it's interesting, one of the criticisms that I have gotten, both when it was just a novella and maybe I saw it a couple times right after the book came out, the reviews have by and large been really positive. Like, I cannot complain. But people are like, why do you hate Daisy so much? And I'm like, okay, you have to think about the lens that I'm looking through. I don't hate Daisy. I think she's a really fascinating character, and I feel sorry for her. She clearly, I don't want to call her a pawn because that's not true. She does have some agency. She decides to stay with Tom even after the catastrophe at the end of the original novel. But Nick is so bitter, just so angry about what she managed to do to Jay, or like the effect that it had on his life, just, turning her back on him completely like he never existed. Nick is furious. And I don't know if you've ever been like in a bitter falling out with a family member, but there's nothing worse than that. And I kept Nick as a first-person narrator, so yeah. First time you see Daisy in the text, he is just livid. Doesn't even at first want anything to do with her. And ironically, it has to be Jay to sit him down to say, look, she's out of our lives now, and we've all made our choices. She is your family, and there's also this kid that I can tell that you're really concerned about. So maybe have a little perspective there. And I think by the end of the book, I have not treated her badly. When she and Tom turn up a couple more times, they've all aged. They've settled into the choices they made. So I don't hate Daisy. As a matter of fact, that's just extremely funny to me. But sometimes it's really easy, I think, to mistake the lens of the character's feeling about other characters for the author personally hating them.
Yeah.
I said if I personally hated any of these characters, I wouldn't even be motivated to write about them.
And that's always an interesting aspect of writing to deal with. Yes, we all put some element of ourselves into our writing. I don't think you can avoid that. It is just part of the process. But for readers who maybe don't have that experience of participating in a creative art of any kind, where that joining is and where the separation is can be hard to determine.
As a consumer of the media, rather than somebody constructing it, I can actually see where that would be a difficult distinction.
It's interesting to feel those questions at times, or just, see them and move on. Sometimes that's the best option too. But what, aside from, you mentioned earlier that Pam was kind of just this one-page cameo that stood out, what made you want to include her and make her this kind of focal point of them and their story and how they changed?
So when Daisy gets in touch with them, they've been together for 10 years. If I had just stopped after, showing Jay's recovery and getting them together as a couple, it would have made it just like a vignette or maybe a short story at best. But I loved the dynamic that they had together so much that I didn't want to just leave it at that. I thought maybe it would be just getting the rekindling that the Baz Luhrmann film did and the rereading to get that obsession or impulse out of my head. But it turned out that I wanted to keep going, and I thought, okay, well, I need to find a way to introduce new conflict or else I have nothing. And so I thought, let me go back through the book. And for whatever reason, that little exchange before they all go together to the hotel where the big blow up happens, I hadn't remembered super clearly the nurse just bringing Pam in, and the description of Jay being just gobsmacked, like he hadn't really conceived of Daisy's child as a real thing. Nick knows about the child, but hadn't seen her before that moment. And I thought, how strange to have taken the time to let a toddler come on screen and actually have one line of dialogue and then just whisk away again. I know that as a plot device, Fitzgerald probably intended us just to say, oh, well, Daisy's a careless mother who just lets the nurse take care of the kid and barely even registers the kid as real herself. But I felt sorry and fascinated by this little child that was just meant to be a literary device, and I thought, actually, there's my in. this kid now is 13 at boarding schools, feisty, a bit strong-willed. I really did try to make sure she had a good mix of Tom's qualities and Daisy's qualities minus the racism. Nobody needs to be passing that on to their kid. And of course, by exposure, she probably got a little of it, but I choose to think she grew up to be a better person. And so I said, wow, a 13-year-old, I remember being 13. That is such a conflicted but exciting age to be. Speaking of giving a little of ourselves to our writing, I probably gave most of that to Pam, actually, because I thought, her mom thinks women should just be beautiful little fools who sit down and marry well and don't worry about a thing, just be pretty. Whereas Pam's not going to be content with that. I think she has a bit of her father's boisterousness and go-get-em attitude. She wants an education, but she also knows that she's different. She knows that she's attracted to girls. She knows that there's been something about her health or her body that her parents have kept from her. There are medical appointments that she doesn't understand what's been going on until it finally does. I don't know that it would be too much of a spoiler to give away what is going on with her, but she, like Nick and Jay, she does turn out to be a queer character in more ways than one. And so having parents that just are not making great decisions for her and what she's starting to realize about herself and try to accept about herself, Nick and Jay give her the space to figure that out and to herself.
Yeah, that was one thing that really caught my attention, is that even though, this is set in the 30s and the early 40s, it brings up a lot of topics that are very timely and relevant to what's going on in today's world. And I think it helps put a real face to some things that, for people who don't have someone in their life who is in the LGBTQ community or, has had that firsthand experience or heard life stories, it's theoretical, and it's easier to either not pay attention or maybe not take the effort to understand when it's at that distance.
The other reason that I really enjoy looking at LGBTQIA issues through a historical lens is that the happy stories don't get told enough, because there's been so much focus on the tragedies and the prejudice and the misunderstanding. There were so many gay people, lesbians, trans people who lived actually happy, full, undisturbed lives in the past. You had queer couples that managed to stay together and under the radar, especially depending on concept of Boston marriages for women. And so like in the Northeast where I place them, it's easier to have people not question that, or if your very closest friends know, it's fine. And as we know from, biographies of people from pretty much any decade, we know plenty of instances of same-gender partnerships that might as well have been marriages. Some intersex people who were lucky enough not to have surgical intervention or be made to conform to something they were not. Or trans people who, even if they didn't have access to hormone therapy or to surgery, that they still managed to live as their gender and not be persecuted for it. And so it's not unrealistic to have a story in which you have two men who have a stable relationship over decades, and to have, a teenager who discovers that biologically she has something different that even influences her attraction and the way she conceptualizes her own gender. I want to underscore that, yes, people lived out these happy lives all the time in the past. I'm tired of killing off queer characters, punishing queer characters, making queer characters the villain. I don't know if you have ever read or seen The Celluloid Closet. It started out as a book by an author named Vito Russo, and it was a film and queer studies thesis about how during the Hays Code era in the United States, Hollywood had to get inventive about how to insert gay subtext, queer subtext into movies. And the central thesis is that this subtext that was so minuscule, you had to be a member of that community to really pick it out when it was happening in films. But then to realize that when it started to get a little more overt, you had to punish that character in some way. So you had to give them an unhappy ending, you had to kill them, you had to make them the villain. And that persisted well into the 90s. I read that as an undergraduate, and it completely changed my life and made me angry and determined to write happy endings for queer characters. I myself, I am gender nonconforming. I am non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. I am intersex. In fact, I was one of those people that it's not always obvious from birth when a child has hormonal or chromosomal differences. Sometimes it can be externally visible if it affects, external development of the body. But in my case, it was something that I learned as an adult. The different factors that can influence gender identity, sexual attraction or lack thereof, there's just so much more in play than most people realize, and we have always had this as human beings. People trying to claim that this is a fad that's only just cropped up in the last 15, 20 years. If you care to look at the record, this has been with us forever.
Well, and I hope that something that people get out of reading your book, not only just enjoying the story, because it is a lovely story, and I really enjoyed reading it. I hope it's thought-provoking for people, and that
is what I hope too.
Inspires to dig into things a little bit more open or understanding, and just take the time to learn a little bit more about some of the things that are going on in today's world that maybe they're not familiar with yet, but could be. I think that's always a great thing, no matter the topic, but especially in this case. Thank you so much, AJ, for coming and taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks for inviting me back.
Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.